The red wagon came down the road before the sun was fully up. Not a tractor, not a truck. A wagon. It rattled behind a 10-year-old girl in a faded barn coat, one wheel wobbling hard enough to squeal every few steps. Inside it were 3 dented buckets, a cracked feed scoop, and a load of brown, wet, half-rotted farm waste that most of Millstone Creek had already decided was ruined. Her name was Clara Bell. She was not walking to school. She was not running away. She was stopping at every farm gate along Old Quarry Road and asking for what the grown-ups had thrown behind the sheds. At the Rusk place, she found a pile of spoiled straw matted black from winter rain. Mr. Rusk had dumped it by the lower fence after his goats refused to bed in it. He watched Clara kneel beside the pile, squeeze a fistful of it, smell it, and scrape it into one of her buckets. He laughed so loud his wife heard him from the porch. By 7:30, the story had already traveled farther than Clara had. The Bell girl was collecting rot. By 8, someone had improved the story. The Bell girl was building a mountain of garbage. By 9, half the creek road knew about the little girl in the barn coat dragging a wagon full of stink like it was treasure. Clara heard some of them. She heard screen doors open. She heard men call across fields. She heard the soft kind of laughter adults use when they think a child is too young to understand humiliation. She understood it perfectly. She just kept pulling the wagon. By the time she reached her family's farm, the buckets were heavy enough to bend the wagon handle. Damp straw, sour leaves, chicken litter, coffee grounds from the diner in town. A bucket of black sludge from behind the apple packing shed that nobody else wanted to touch. Her father, Thomas Bell, stood in the barn doorway with his coffee cooling in one hand. He looked at the wagon. Then he looked at his daughter. Clara looked back like she was waiting for him to say something useful. Thomas did not. He only said, "Wash your hands before breakfast." That was how the whole thing began. Not with a miracle, not with a speech. With a child dragging other people's waste home while the valley laughed at her for noticing what they had stopped seeing. Millstone Creek, Kentucky sat in a long limestone fold between 2 low ridges, where the spring water ran cold and the fields looked generous from a distance. In May, the bottomland turned green so fast it seemed impossible that anything could be wrong beneath it. But farmers do not live by distance, they live by what happens when the shovel goes in. And for 3 seasons, Thomas Bell had been learning a hard lesson 1 acre at a time. His corn looked strong in June and tired in July, his beans set blossoms and then seemed to lose interest. After every hard rain, water skinned across the field instead of soaking down. After every dry week, the ground sealed over and cracked like fired clay. He did what men around him did. He bought more fertilizer, he ran the disc deeper. He blamed the weather, then the seed, then the cost of everything. But the field kept answering in the same flat language, less, less, less. When county soil technician Marcia Eldon came out in late August, Thomas expected a lecture about inputs. Instead, she pushed a probe into the row, pulled out a dull gray plug of earth, and broke it between her fingers. "Your soil is tired," she said. Thomas frowned. "Soil doesn't get tired." Marcia looked across the rows. "Living things do." She pointed to the hard layer 6 inches down. She showed him where the roots had turned sideways instead of pushing deeper. She talked about organic matter, compaction, pore space, microbial activity, and the difference between feeding a crop and rebuilding the place a crop has to live. Thomas listened with the expression of a man who knew the woman was probably right and also knew that right did not pay a seed bill in November. Clara listened from the far side of the tailgate. Nobody had invited her into the conversation. That did not keep her from taking notes. She had always been that kind of child, quiet enough to be missed, stubborn enough to miss nothing. At school, Clara was not the loudest in class. She did not raise her hand first. She did not win spelling bees or science fairs or the kind of attention adults call promise because it arrives in a familiar shape. But she noticed the underside of things. She knew which barn cats limped after rain. She knew which tomato row in her mother's kitchen patch stayed green longest. She knew that her grandmother Ruth's old leaf pile behind the smokehouse smelled different from the wet trash piles behind other farms. Ruth Bell was the one who taught her to trust her nose. Bad rot tells on itself, Ruth said one afternoon, sitting on an overturned milk crate with a paring knife in her apron pocket. It smells sharp. Sour. Like something trapped. Clara pinched a crumble of dark finished compost from Ruth's pile. And good rot. Ruth smiled. Good rot smells like the woods after rain. That sentence stayed with Clara. So did what Ruth showed her next. The pile behind the smokehouse was not just dead leaves. It was coffee grounds, eggshells, grass clippings, old hay, apple peels, and shredded newspaper. Ruth layered wet with dry. Green with brown, fast with slow, she kept it damp, but not drowned. She turned it when the middle got too hot and ignored it when it needed to rest. When Clara dug a little hole into the finished edge, she found earthworms folded through it like red threads. She found crumbly black matter that held together and fell apart at the same time. And deeper in the pile, she saw fine white lines lacing through the old leaves. Fungus? Clara asked. Friends, Ruth said. Most folks only notice fungus when it ruins something. They forget it also finishes things. That winter, Clara began seeing the creek road differently. Not as a line between farms, as a map of forgotten piles. Spoiled bedding behind the Rusk barn. Leaves bagged and split open behind the church. Diner coffee grounds dumped into the alley barrel, chicken waste too strong for anyone to use straight. Half-rotted mulch abandoned at the nursery because it had gone sour in the plastic. Everyone else saw mess, Clara saw ingredients. Her first test was a disaster. She did not tell anyone she was doing it. She took a few buckets of spoiled straw, some wet leaves, and chicken litter from behind the coop. She mixed them in a small patch beside her mother's garden and planted lettuce starts under a row cover. For 2 days, she felt brilliant. By the 4th day, the leaves yellowed at the edges. By the 6th, half the lettuce had collapsed. The soil around the stems was warm to the touch. The smell rising from it was harsh enough to make her step back. Clara stood there with the row cover bunched in her hands, fighting the hot sting behind her eyes. She had not grown anything. She had burned it. That evening, she walked to Ruth's house without speaking to anyone. Ruth listened, then handed her a kitchen thermometer so old the numbers had faded on one side. Half-finished rot is hungry, Ruth said. It steals while it changes. You don't feed babies with bread dough before it has baked. Clara wrote that down. The next morning, she rode her bike to the county library. She checked out 3 books with titles that made the librarian lift her eyebrows. Soil Life and Garden Fertility. Composting for Small Farms. The Underground Work of Roots. Then she asked Marcia Eldon at the extension office for anything about carbon and nitrogen. Marcia gave her a folder of printed sheets, a used compost thermometer from a workshop box, and one warning. Don't make it complicated just to sound smart, she said. Make it alive. So Clara started over. This time, she built the pile behind the equipment shed where the winter sun touched it by noon. She laid down coarse stalks first so air could move underneath. Then spoiled straw, then coffee grounds. Then leaves. Then a thin layer of chicken litter. Then more dry carbon to calm it down. She added 2 shovelfuls from Ruth's finished compost, not because it looked important, but because it carried the living workers she needed. She watered the pile until a squeezed handful felt like a wrung-out sponge. Not dripping, not dusty. Alive enough to wake. On the third day, the center reached 126 degrees. On the fifth day, it reached 143. Clara stood over the pile with the thermometer in her hand, as if she had heard a heartbeat through the ground. She turned it. Steam lifted into the cold air. That was the part the neighbors saw, not the notes, not the failed lettuce, not the library books stacked under her bed. They saw a small girl in mud-caked boots turning garbage behind a shed in February. And the laughter came back. Mr. Rusk asked Thomas if Clara was starting a landfill. Someone at the feed store said maybe the Bell farm was so broke they had decided to farm trash. Thomas heard it. He did not like it, but he also did not stop her. Somewhere between the failed lettuce and the steaming pile, he had begun to understand that his daughter was not playing. She was working on a problem he had been too tired to face from a different direction. By March, the pile had changed, the sour edge disappeared first, then, the shape of the ingredients blurred. Straw, leaves, coffee grounds, manure, stems, all of it softened into a dark, even texture. The pile no longer smelled like waste, it smelled clean and deep, like the shaded part of the woods where nobody plows. Clara screened it through an old milk crate. She spread 3 inches across a 12-foot strip near the kitchen garden, and worked it only into the top few inches, the way Marcia had told her. Do not bury the living layer too deep. Do not punish the soil for trying to recover. In April, she planted 6 tomato seedlings, 2 rows of beans, and 1 short row of corn from the same seed bag Thomas used in the south field. Then came the waiting. Waiting is the part of farming that outsiders never understand. It looks like nothing. It feels like being judged by whether you cannot bargain with. For 2 weeks, Clara checked the bed every morning before school. For 2 weeks, there was nothing to brag about. Then the beans came up thick. The tomato leaves darkened. The corn pushed through with a clean green blade and kept going. By June, the difference was not subtle anymore. The 12-foot strip looked like it belonged to another farm. Not bigger in the showy way fertilizer can make plants look bigger for a while. Stronger. The leaves held color through dry afternoons. Rain soaked in instead of standing on the surface. When Clara pushed a finger into the soil, it opened without cracking. When she lifted a tomato root ball at Marcia's request, the roots were white, branched, and tangled through crumbs of soil that clung like a good cake. Marcia stood there for a long moment. Thomas watched her face, because experts can say plenty before they speak. Finally, Marcia said, "This is structure." She held up a handful of the amended soil and let it fall apart slowly. Aggregates. Air pockets. Water holding where roots can reach it, nutrients releasing at the speed plants can use. Clara looked down at the bed. Because of the compost. Because the compost brought back the workers, Marcia said. Bacteria. Fungi. Worms, the invisible part of the farm. Thomas did not say anything. But that evening, he walked alone to the south field and pushed a shovel into his own ground. The difference embarrassed him. His soil broke in slabs, Clara's broke in crumbs. By late July, nobody was laughing. The tomatoes came in heavy enough that Clara had to tie the cages again with baling twine. The beans hung thick under the leaves, the short corn row stood shoulder-high on a child, and set ears so full Thomas measured them twice because he did not like the first answer. Marcia helped compare the numbers properly. Same seed source. Same planting window, same rainfall. Small test plot, not a miracle claim, but the evidence was still evidence. The corn from Clara's strip ran 26% heavier by year weight than the south field sample. The bean plants carried nearly a third more pods per row foot. After a hard storm, water disappeared into Clara's bed in minutes while the field below the lane stayed glazed for half the morning. Mr. Rusk came over after supper and stood at the edge of the strip with his hat in both hands. For once, he did not joke. What did she put on it? He asked. Thomas glanced at Clara. Then he looked at the soil. What we threw away, he said. That answer moved through Millstone Creek slower than the laughter had. Laughter travels fast because nobody has to change after it. Proof travels slower. It asks something of people. By August, 3 neighbors had asked Clara where to start. She did not pretend to be more than she was. She told them what she had learned the hard way. Do not spread raw waste on tender plants. Do not drown a pile and call it compost. Give wet things dry company. Give dry things moisture. Let heat do its work. Let air in. Wait until the pile stops smelling like a mistake. Ruth sat on the porch the first afternoon Clara explained all that to 2 grown men leaning on a truck bed. She never interrupted, she only shelled beans into a pan and watched the men nod at a 10-year-old girl they had laughed at 6 months earlier. That fall, Thomas did not convert the whole farm at once. He could not afford drama. Farmers who survive do not gamble just because one strip of ground tells a beautiful story. But he changed 10 acres, he planted a cover crop after harvest, rye and clover. He reduced 1 tillage pass. He spread Clara's finished compost along the worst headland. Not thick, not wastefully, just enough to begin. He fenced off the place where runoff had been cutting a scar through the lower field. And seeded it with grasses that would hold. The first year did not save the farm. That matters. Stories lie when they make the land heal overnight. The first year only stopped the slide, the second year, water stood less often. The third year, roots went deeper, the fourth year, the soil test showed organic matter rising where it had been falling for as long as Thomas had records. And year by year, the Bell farm became less desperate for quick answers. Not free from cost. Not free from weather. Not free from failure. But steadier. More forgiving. More alive underfoot. Clara kept a notebook through all of it. Dates, temperatures, ratios that worked and ratios that did not, which piles heated too fast. Which ones dried at the edges? Which farm waste needed more leaves? Which manure needed more time? Which field corner took water first and gave it back last? By the time she was 13, grown farmers were bringing her jars of soil. They did not call it garbage anymore, they called it material. That was the first sign Millstone Creek had changed, not the harvest, the language, because once people name something differently, they begin to see it differently. One afternoon, Mr. Rusk brought a bucket of spoiled straw to the Bell farm and set it beside Clara's composting area. He looked embarrassed. Clara waited. Finally, he said, "You want this?" She lifted the lid, checked the smell, and nodded. "It's not finished," she said, "but it can be." Mr. Rusk rubbed the back of his neck. "I thought it was ruined." Clara closed the bucket. It was only waiting for the right work. That was the lesson the valley had missed. The red wagon was never about trash, the compost was never only about tomatoes. And Clara Bell's gift was never that she knew more than everyone else. It was that she looked long enough to notice a hidden process where other people saw an ending. A field is not just dirt, it is memory, every root that fed it, every leaf that fell into it. Every worm tunnel, every handful of matter returned instead of burned, buried, or hauled away. The soil remembers neglect. But it also remembers care, and in Millstone Creek, the first person to understand. That was not the man with the tractor loan, or the neighbor with the loudest laugh, or the expert with the clipboard. It was a 10-year-old girl with mud on her coat, a squeaking red wagon behind her, and the patience to believe that what looked wasted might still be working. The field remembered what everyone else had thrown away.